In this segment, I'm going to be talking more about the cultural side of the Jazz Age. We've talked about the politics of the 1920s and the Republican Party, talked a bit about the kind of affluent, at least surface affluent economy of the 1920s. But in this segment in particular, I'd like to start exploring the cultural side of the so-called Jazz Age of the 1920s, and I'd like to do so with a kind of inherent argument at work. Now remember, for politics, I'd argued that you have activism, but it's activism of a certain kind with reservation, and activism designed to preserve a certain normalcy or status quo. Well, in a way, that reeks of a progressive idea. In terms of culture, let me suggest that you had at least two forces at work flowing out of the war, the First World War. On the one hand, you had a sort of culture of liberation, and you could almost see it as a sort of a culture of nihilism. In other words, the very horrors of the war, because they had been so horrible, because an entire generation of young men had been virtually wiped out in the trenches of Europe, you could almost see that as a justification for saying, almost in a hedonistic way, I suppose, that live, eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow you may die. In other words, death is on the doorstep. Let it all go. Let it all hang out, to use an earlier phrase. And do what makes you happy. Now, there's a certain kind of liberation in the horrors of war in that sense. Not to make light of war at all. It's not what I'm doing. But to suggest that for many of the writers, many of the cultural leaders of the 1920s, especially among that era's youth, there was perhaps that sense of foreboding that they never fully escaped, having experienced, or at least from a distance, witnessed the effects of war on Europe. But there are some other factors at work here. One of them, of course, is what happens with women during the war, women in particular. Remember that women have, for a long while, lived within, especially middle-class women, I should clarify that, have lived within a sort of notion of womanhood that connects the female within a marriage, say, or within society, always to a male. The female is limited, is restricted to a role of domesticity in the home, so that it's not appropriate for a middle-class woman necessarily to go out and seek work. Certainly a married woman, that's the role of the husband, to go into the public sphere. This role of domesticity instead links the woman with child rearing in particular, and with procreation. Now the idea, of course, the idea behind this, the argument is, it's one of preserving the purity of womanhood. And it's bound up with things like fashion and other ways of constructing culturally the feminine. One of the examples I often use in class is the example of the Gibson girl. Even for young women in training, women who are supposed to grow up to become wives and mothers, in that older traditional sense, long skirts, for instance, long hair that's not to be cut. And one of my favorite stories by F. Scott Fitzgerald has got to be Bernice Bobs Her Hair. The idea of cutting a woman's hair, or a woman cutting her own hair, is just unthinkable, because tied or bound with domesticity, bound with womanhood, is long hair. What I'm going to suggest here is the ways in which World War I and the opportunities that become available to women, I think, allow women to call the cultural definitions, the identity with which they live, call that identity into question. And if you remember, during the war, women will find work in areas of the economy where they hadn't worked before. So, for instance, they're going to be working in offices, they'll be working in factories. And of course, a lot of women, lower class women, had worked in factories. Their mothers had worked in factories, forever, for generations. But the types of factories where these women work will be expanded. In other words, munitions, in heavier manufacturing. But then, remember, women have moved into the office, clerks, secretaries, and in positions of authority, police, fire, mail delivery, things of that nature. Well, in the 1920s, you could argue that women who had been doing more during the war, well, at least some women will persist in these jobs. They'll move more and more women working into the American mainstream of acceptable behavior. And they'll do so working in fashion, they'll work in the publishing industry. Women will work in cosmetics and become really important players in cosmetics, as well as in education and in nursing in particular. They will also, and I think this is worth consideration, these women who are making money, who are working, but also women in the domestic sphere, in the sort of middle class sphere, will get more control over household consumption. Notice that many of the products I talked about earlier in terms of appliances, for instance, are intended for the household and for household use. But women will become the focus of advertisement for things like automobiles as well. There's a really great Ford Motor advertisement enticing a woman, a new independent woman, to purchase an automobile because an automobile means independence for the new woman. See that tie between gender and independence and this new technology, culture and technology hand in hand. We also, however, can talk about sexuality, and specifically a new interest in the 1920s in various forms of birth control. For however long you want to go back, of course, the issue of abortion, of ending an unwanted pregnancy, had been one of the possible routes for birth control open to women. But in the 1920s, and we'd seen it even a little bit prior, especially related to the work of Margaret Sanger, someone you might want to read more about. Sanger, almost in a progressive sense, had seen the impact of unwanted births on the poor, on lower class women and lower class families. And rather than abortion necessarily, had sought to induce women, especially lower class women, to consider the options that birth control might offer. Now, the interesting thing here is that birth control implies the female, the woman, the wife, the mother, taking control as much as was possible at the time, taking control over this process of procreation, even within a marriage. And that could be a real bone of contention, so to speak, a real point of tension in a marriage if the male felt threatened by this. And yet, what this effort, this push, and this acceptance of birth control that we see reflects is a new conception of sex and marriage that moves beyond procreation. Certainly something that I think we see more and more in society even today. And that's going to be, I think, most apparent with the young, with youth. You'll see it with the married women, with mothers, but with the youth of the 1920s, the so-called lost generation, the youth of the jazz age, in combination with the other indicators, the cultural symbols that put them in the jazz age, there will be that underlying new sexuality and a new attitude towards sex. With that, I'm going to end this segment, and we'll pick up again with the jazz age and the tensions of the era. Thanks.